Welcome everybody back to the Subliminal Show. Today I have the honor of sitting down with Alexander. We knew each other a long time ago in in a galaxy far, far away. But he was willing to come on to the show and just talk about the stuff that he's done in his undergrad as well as his master's program, continuing with his ministry at his church, as well as just a heart for the neurodivergent and LGBTQ plus community. Has been an incredible, just heartwarming thing for me to see his love and compassion for these different types of communities. So thank you, Alexander, for being here. And is there anything you want to add to that introduction, or?
No, I think that was all great. Thank you for having me. Yeah, this is our first time seeing each other in a long time, and it's good to see your face again.
But we'll go ahead and start our first topic with neurodivergence. So if you could just explain for us just what is neurodivergence?
Yeah, so neurodivergence is really more of an umbrella term that just describes really any interest or instance in which the brain functions different from what is considered typical or most common. This can include like mental illness, cognitive disabilities, really any phenomenon that isn't reflective of the majority experience. I know for me it includes like neurodevelopmental disorders such as autism and ADHD, but it can also include eating disorders, obsessive compulsive disorders, PTSD, anxiety, depression, really any of these different diagnoses that you would see in the DSM or through other diagnostic criteria. The list goes on.
So then what about the neurodivergent community really drew you to it?
Yeah, I mean, part of me wants to say that, I saw the issues in my society, wanted to do something about it. Mm-hmm. But I think a lot of it was just being forced into it by my own diagnoses, my own experience with ableism. And it wasn't until I already built up those tools based on my own identity that I was able to really understand just how prevalent ableism is in society. I know that I was diagnosed really early on in elementary school with ADHD, but it took really a degree in psychology and about 3 panic attacks to see a psychologist for the anxiety diagnosis and the autism diagnosis. And really, the more I connected to my identity and my community, the more I was able to get to know other people who are neurodivergent and different diagnoses and learn about their experience with ableism and inaccessibility in the world. And so I think just hearing and understanding these stories gave me the tools and the passion to really advocate for the community as a whole instead of just my own 504 and IEP plans and accommodations in school.
Mm-hmm. So how would, for those of us who are not quite fully educated, how do we determine which kind of organizations are actually being helpful and which ones aren't?
Yeah, I think general ideas to look at the boards, look at who is in leadership in those positions. Are they having leadership positions that are mainly autistic people or members of that community? Or are they mainly neurotypical people that are just making decisions for us? And otherwise, if there aren't easily accessed resources regarding that, you can always find communities or resources written by autistic people online that will often speak to different organizations. I know just off the top of my head, there are organizations such as the Autism Self-Advocacy Network and the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network that are really focused on highlighting autistic leadership and really promoting that, listening to the stories, as I talked about earlier. And so those are two organizations that really focus on our voices instead of really suppressing autistic tendencies like Autism Speaks.
And so kind of in that vein of making these kind of mistakes when it comes to, like you talked about how ableism is, or being ableist is almost more times than not accidental and just a lot of just lack of education. But what are some of the biggest mistakes that people make when talking about the neurodivergent community, or just like you mentioned, the puzzle piece and Light It Up Blue? Are there any other things that come to mind as just a big thing that we assume is right, but may not be?
Yeah, I think that every different diagnosis comes with its own stereotypes, its own misconceptions, and the general experience is simply, as you said, like, how are they talking about us? If they're talking about us without us, as the typical phrase goes,
Yeah.
then it's not typically going to actually listen to our voices.
Okay.
Especially in the neurodivergent community, when a lot of people can make the mistake of infantilizing the people, of seeing them as less capable of caring for themselves, then if they're wanting to find an expert, they'll go to a special education teacher or a parent or a therapist instead of actually going to someone with that diagnosis. And instead of coming to those in our proximity, they should really just come to us to listen to our stories. And I think that's something that is so very accessible in today's world, whether it's YouTube, TikTok, books, blogs, articles. I think that there's always stories that can be heard. I think another tendency kind of alongside that is the tendency to lump neurodivergence together when it's one of the most diverse communities. I'm not going to have much experience with OCD or eating disorders or schizophrenia because I don't have those diagnoses, and those stories are going to have to come from people who do. And I think that's why these labels and these terminology are really helpful for us when it comes to finding our community and just sharing our stories with one another. I think that a lot of times people can misconstrue what these labels mean because they're often used to force us into a box. But for us, it's really known as a way of getting to know the individual, which should always be the priority.
Yeah,
I know
absolutely.
one of the common misconceptions I've experienced a lot is simply the statement, "Oh, you don't look autistic." And the truth is, yes, I do. And I know that I do because so many autistic people have told me that I do, because they can identify me easily. I think that a lot of people just think I don't look autistic because they've learned to see just one stereotypical version by watching Atypical or The Good Doctor, and their idea of autism is simply limited. The same way people will come away from horror movies with a really scary version of what dissociative identity disorder looks like or schizophrenia, when all of these stories are just one stereotype that are being portrayed. So being able to get to know the individual on a deeper level than the label is a great way to just start the conversation and get to learn one another's stories. This is one of the difficulties and the harmful trends that can come with just pathologizing an entire demographic.
So really allowing those individuals to, even though neurodivergence is such a massive, it encompasses a lot of different disorders and diagnoses, good old English language. The individual stories can't be lost, and they shouldn't be lost in the by lumping them together in those boxes like you talked about. And what has kind of been your experience with that? Has there been some more benefits to having a label, or has it been pretty harmful of, like you talked about, being shoved into a box?
Yeah, I think it's one of those trends where I talked about the label more as a sense of understanding and an insight into community rather than anything else. And for example, this is why I actually have a more outdated version of the DSM behind me, because I like being able to rely on those labels, and it's something that continuously grows and evolves. I know the last version of the DSM used Asperger's alongside autism, which was really named after a Nazi scientist who would separate the two demographics. And before that, queer identities were included in the DSM as a mental illness. And even before that, there was a mental illness to describe slaves that wanted to escape from their masters, because that was seen as such a illogical thing, when in
Yeah.
reality it's simply different people existing. And
Mm.
so I think that labels can be useful as long as they're created to reflect experiences instead of created to
Mm.
limit or trap experiences into one
Okay.
identity. And I think pathology, yeah, in terms of being used in the medical sense or the sense to quote unquote cure,
Hmm.
can be helpful when the disability or disorder itself is
Okay.
causing pain. For example, with me, like when it comes to my autism, what I really need is
Mm.
accessibility and
Hmm.
education. And that's a major part of my
Yeah.
advocacy work. However, when it comes to my anxiety disorder, I really need
Mm.
medication and things that'll keep my heart from racing to the point where I think I'm having a
Yeah.
heart attack. And for ADHD, it's really a combination of the both, where without my medication, I can get severe headaches.
Mm.
But even with the medication, there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of education and
Yeah.
accessibility in school settings or work settings. So it really depends on how much pain comes from the disorder or
Okay.
disability itself, such as
Yeah.
with chronic illnesses, and how much pain is just coming from
Mm.
society and the way disabled people are treated or provides an accessibility.
Okay.
I mean, with any other vital organ causing pain, we would easily accept
Hmm.
medication, and the brain is
Yeah.
just the same way. But to assume that even the majority of our struggles come from our
Mm.
disability itself would be to ignore all the
Yeah.
inaccessibility. It's kind of where another thing that Autism Speaks is
Mm.
notorious for is what's called ABA
Okay.
therapy, or applied behavioral
Yeah.
analysis, which is essentially conversion therapy for
Mm.
autistic people and serves to really train these autistic traits out
Mm.
of someone. And that focuses on the wrong thing instead of really accepting autistic traits and learning to normalize them in society. We
Mm.
pathologize them and teach them as something that needs to be eradicated instead of
Yeah.
accepted. I know one of the common misconceptions is that autism is categorized as a communication
Mm.
disorder. But when it comes to communication, I've always been able to code switch between neurotypical and autistic people because I had
Hmm.
to growing up. Whereas a lot of neurotypical people won't put the same effort in simply because they don't
Mm.
have to, as the majority demographic. And so being able to recognize that accessibility is a universal task instead of just something that is the responsibility of the
Yeah.
disabled community is a great way to move past the pathologizing paradigm to this more inclusion of
Mm.
neurodiversity and acceptance of different brain types, so long as that brain type isn't directly causing pain itself.
So, what are some practical ways that just individuals on either side of neurodivergent, neurotypical can help advocate for the neurodivergent community?
Yeah, I think one of them is the idea of language. I think we do tend to get a little bit into language in a more distracting sense, where people create terms like differently abled in order to act like that's a huge issue, or they'll say, oh, use person with autism instead of autistic person, when we really never asked for that. But at the same time, language can be important when we're actually referring to disability in our society. For example, like when we reference disability, are we referencing it as a human identity or as a bad thing? I know the church is notorious for doing this a lot in hymns, where we use blindness and deafness or even lameness as metaphors for ignorance or inferiority. And it's the same way in modern speak, where someone will claim to be so ADHD just because they're distracted, or they'll claim to be OCD simply for being tidy, when that not only portrays these diagnoses by their stereotypes, but it really describes it just as a bad thing that can be reduced to an insult instead of a full demographic. And I think as a society, we've already moved past the R slur and using that in common speak. But at the same time, we can still use words like spastic or ADHD or autistic as insults themselves instead of finding more accurate terminology to describe them. And then just the thing that I said earlier about education, that there are always organizations that you can give money to, like the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network or Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. But ultimately, the real education comes from learning from neurodivergent people. Now, I know that I'm specifically called to education, and other than that, I'm a big advocate of not putting the burden on neurodivergent people to teach others. But so many already have shared their stories, as I talked about with books, articles, blogs, YouTube channels, poems, spoken words. Being able to access this material online, really, there's more content than could be consumed in a lifetime. And so the best way to advocate for others is to just listen to their voices and their stories, and not just the voices of neurotypical people who have researched or merely witnessed our identity in their work setting or in their families, but actually those of us who have experienced it ourselves.
Okay. That's cool. Well, thank you for that insight, and I greatly appreciate that, and being willing to speak into not only a little bit of your own story, but also be able to be an advocate for this community. All right, so we'll go ahead and transition into queering and kind of queer justice. So if you just wouldn't mind just telling us and defining what is queering.
Yeah, so I mean, even regarding the term queer, long before it was associated with the LGBTQIA plus community, it meant strange or abnormal. And when our society is built around this binary, gender-driven, heterosexual-oriented ideal, anything outside of that mold is by nature rebellious in some regard. It can be really easy for people to see the sudden addition of queer characters in media or queer interpretation of old material as merely woke or intentional in some regard, when in reality it's just the natural progression of art reflecting humanity. It was never that queer people didn't exist before, but we simply weren't portrayed in media and our voices were silenced. So queering is the act of combating this bias and this normativity that has portrayed queerness as merely a fringe group for so long. By queering media or literature or society itself, we challenge the notion that heterosexual or cisgender identities are the only quote-unquote normal. And we challenge the idea that society should only be built for those people. We can see that we've normalized this kind of mythical concept of normality, or as Audre Lorde calls it, the mythical norm, to the extent that Black characters, female characters, queer characters, or disabled characters are seen as an attack or an intentional effort to further an agenda rather than an exodus from the agenda that's already at play. In reality, life does have Black, female, queer, and disabled people. A lot of times, more than one of those identities can be in the same person, like with me. And art is finally being able to reflect that reality. It's the same way with interpretations of history or scripture, or old documents, where we aren't making everything gayer or changing the past to reflect our narrative, but rather we're just removing the bias that has limited historical interpretations to just one demographic. So by querying society, we normalize the abnormal. We reject the notion that this one experience is the standard. And it's kind of the same concept with the term neuroqueer, where society isn't, or this term isn't just about being neurodivergent and queer at the same time, but rather queering our society in regards to the neurotypical mold and the neurotypical standard. And so being able to claim that the tendency of our society to portray certain communication styles or certain ideals of professionalism or classroom settings to just one neurotype is really the source of our struggles, as I said earlier. So by neuroqueering society, we really assert that it isn't just the responsibility of our demographic to appease neurotypical standards, but rather the responsibility of everyone to create a more accessible environment, challenging these barriers that only exist to keep neurodivergent people separate and apart. And so by queering things in different regards, we just challenge the ideas that have always been put in place and really embrace that fringe demographic as really just a normal part of humanity and a normal part of our history.
Okay, so it really is just bringing to focus that, this isn't something new. It's been a part of our history for a very long time. We're just now being a little bit more okay with bringing it into more art forms and into media and into Hollywood. And so it's wanting to not be like, oh, we're making it gay, but just like, no, we're making it the way it's always been. It's been this way for a very long time. So similarly to the neurodivergent, I'm going to ask the same question of just like, what are some common misconceptions that people have of queer and or the LGBTQIA plus community?
Yeah, I think, the most stereotypical and the most well-known misconception is this idea of choice, of thinking that it's something that someone chooses to be instead of something that's inherent to their identity. And I think that that's probably the biggest hurdle that I've experienced when enduring or facing homophobia, is that many will refuse to believe me. And I think a big part of it is because many people were introduced to the queer community, not in health class or science class or history class, but in a church that isn't necessarily accepting, and in calls to hurt the queer community. And really, a lot of people have latched onto that image that was first presented to them. And I think the other generalized misconception is just over-sexualizing the community, and to the point that everything queer is seen as sexual, like whether it's a pride parade or drag queen story hour or just a queer character in a TV show. And I think that's because they've only heard queerness talked about from this notion of man shall not lie with man, without realizing that that term homosexual wasn't even added into the Bible until 1946. And so for those of us in the community, sex is really only just a small part of our identity. I think that queerness in general is just defined by that first flutter in our stomach when we realize that we're different, by the hatred and bullying that we face, but also the community that surrounded us and protected us from this hatred, as well as the violence we see on the news, the fight to control our own bodies, and even just the triumph of finally being able to feel proud in our own skin. Yeah, I think, especially from the ministry perspective, that we don't just see queerness in these same-sex relationships like King David and Jonathan, but we see it in the strength of Daniel when the law was created specifically to harm him, or in the journey of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who went through a name change, went through a fiery furnace. And the bravery of Queen Vashti, who refused to have her body sexualized and controlled by others, even though it meant giving up her power. And so all of these characters aren't necessarily queer in our sense today, but they reflect the same struggles and experiences that our community has faced. And so I think in regards to misconception, we've been taught to only know that a character in a book or TV show is queer if we hear it explicitly stated, or we see them kiss the same gender, but in reality, queerness is so much more than that. Yeah, I think because simply, going back to the ministry component, as a Christian, I believe that humanity is made in the image of God. And for that to be true, then we all have to be made in the image of God. And so when we grow to understand more of humanity as a whole, then we also gain a more holistic understanding of who God is and God's full identity as reflected in God's creation of humanity. And it's kind of like that motif of a mosaic or a stained glass window, when only by understanding each individual piece that we can really see the full picture.
So really, yeah, like you talked about with neurodivergence and advocating for that, wanting to create a safe space, a space that is well educated and is willing to say, you know, you are loved and cared for here in this space.
Yeah, exactly.
And then kind of just wrapping up, what are just some practical ways that individuals like me can help advocate for the queer community?
Yeah, I think it's really just the same thing as before, of listening to the stories and growing in that knowledge. As I talked about the different autistic-related organizations that I'm familiar with, there are also different foundations like the Trevor Project that seeks to help queer youth at risk of suicide. Or here in Chicago, there's the Chicago Night Ministry that helps queer teens who have been kicked out of their homes or have either run away from abusive environments. I know that ACLU and the Human Rights Campaign seek to help from that legal standpoint of challenging laws that put our safety at risk. But at the same time, money can only do so much, and more can be done by just passing along these stories. From that psychological perspective, there's an idea called the mere exposure effect that shows that simply being around someone different than you or listening to those stories can reduce animosity. And sharing stories helps to humanize those that society often depicts as inferior. Absolutely. So being able to, as I said, listen and then teach others what you hear is really helpful for the queer community, because it means that the burden doesn't always fall on us to be those teachers. And we're able to simply focus more on living our life and teaching when we have to survive. And that's really what it is that it's always been a form of survival, whereas for allies, it's more of a choice. And so being able to constantly advocate for our existence can be exhausting. So having allies who are able to do that for us is a way to just give us a moment to breathe. So I think, as we change as a society, our language does as well. It can be really easy to become defensive of different terms, as woke or an agenda based. But I think that really the one mantra to leave off with is that if someone tells you something hurts, it's not your place to tell them it doesn't. That's really the best that anyone could do, is just don't try to hurt people. That making mistakes is always going to happen, but if you're specifically calling someone by the wrong pronouns just because you want to see them suffer, or that you're specifically creating this one law because you think it'll cause the most amount of pain, then that's not what we're called to do as humans, as Christians, or really as just people. We live in a world where I think people can sometimes become distracted by their own convenience over another person's pain. And so being able to just remember that those around us matter so much more than our convenience or our beliefs even. That, I mean, I would refer to someone by a different name or pronoun every day if it just meant that they would feel a little bit more loved. And I think the same can be true for any community or any people, that being able to call them by the name they prefer, call them by the term that most uplifts them, is just the closest way to show your love for that person. And it's something that applies to the neurodivergent community, that applies to different people from different countries and different races, that just being able to listen and grow and love one another is the step towards a better society.
Well, thank you, Alexander, for once again being willing to just share part of your story as well as just your passions for these two different communities. And obviously, I know as the loving and caring individual that you are, your love and compassion goes to anyone and everyone, just sharing that love to as many people as you can. But yeah, I thank you for being willing to come on and just talk and share your story. And is there anything else that you'd like to add before we wrap up?
We talked a bit about this one website that I've been creating, and that just goes back to the idea of terms, where it's not objective resource in any means, but it's something that is just full of the words and terms I wish I had known growing up as an autistic person that helped me better understand my experiences. And so being able to use that website, which can be in the description box below, to better understand your autistic friends, better understand your own identity if you're exploring who you are, is a great way to really just begin that conversation. And it's also a medium where you can reach out to me if you have any questions, any stories you want to share, or just thoughts, because being able to have those conversations and asking genuine questions born out of curiosity is the strongest and most straightforward path towards learning that I think is ever possible.
Yep. Yeah, as Alexander said, all those links will be in the description. And yeah, like he said, if you want to reach out, have questions, he is welcome and ready for them. But yeah, thank you everybody for listening and watching. We're on YouTube, we're on Instagram, we're on Facebook. Like, subscribe, comment, all of the typical things you say. And we will see you all next week.